Okay then. Hello and welcome to Studies in Archaic Buddhism. I think we're at part 7 now. I'm your host, Pannobhasa. And today's little study, partly by request, is going to be on the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta of the Atthakavagga. So, as usual with videos like this, first I'll read the sutta and then I'll follow up with some commentary. Because the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta, although not well known to Buddhists in any country really, still I consider it to be very important. And it's a very ancient, early sutta from the Atthakavagga. And the Atthakavagga is itself, in my opinion, the largest fragment of archaic pre-Theravada Buddhism in existence. Not just pre-Theravada, but like pre-dogmatic Buddhism, really. Or at least when dogma was just kind of starting to get its foot in the door very, very early on in the history of Buddhism. So anyways, the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta is discourse number 11 of the Atthakavagga, and it's relatively long. The Atthakavagga is organized in accordance with length. So the shortest sutta is the first one, and the longest sutta is the last one. And this is number 11, so it's multi-verses. So I might as well just get started on reading this, and this is my own translation. I translated this back around 1998 when I was still a monk. So, derived from what are quarrels and contentions, lamentations and sorrows, along with fear of loss, conceit and contempt, along with denigration? From what have they derived? Please tell us this. And then the Buddha answers. Derived from what is loved are quarrels and contentions, lamentations and sorrows, along with fear of loss, conceit and contempt, along with denigration, conjoined with fear of loss, are quarrels and contentions, and denigration is from contentions that have arisen. So then the questioner asks, in what in the world would what is loved be founded? Also, whatever yearnings roam over the world, and founded in what are hopes and ends which are for a man's future state? The Buddha answers, founded in preference is what is loved in the world, and also whatever yearnings roam over the world, and founded in this are hopes and ends which are for a man's future state. Then the questioner asks, preference is founded in what in the world, also derived from what are discriminations, anger, falsehood, and brooding uncertainty, and also whatever philosophies are declared by the philosopher. And the Buddha answers, what they call pleasant and unpleasant in the world, depending on that preference derives. Having viewed among forms non-existence and existence, a person makes a discrimination in the world. Then the questioner asks, no, he doesn't. The Buddha continues. Let's see. Anger, falsehood, and brooding uncertainty, and those philosophies also are in just that pair. The uncertain one should train himself on the path of understanding, the philosophies declared by the philosopher having been understood. So then the questioner asks, in what are founded pleasant and unpleasant? In what not being do they not exist? And non-existence and existence too, whatever that means, tell me that in which they are founded. So then the Buddha answers, in stimulation are founded pleasant and unpleasant. In stimulation not being, they do not exist. Non-existence and existence too, whatever it means, I tell you that they are founded in this. Then the questioner asks, stimulation is founded in what in the world? Also, derived from what are possessions? In what not being is there no sense of mindness? In devoidness of what do stimulations not stimulate? Then the Buddha answers, stimulation is conditioned by name and form. Founded in desire are possessions. In desire not being, there is no sense of mindness. In devoidness of form, stimulations do not stimulate. So then the questioner asks, in one how attained does form become void, and how also do ease and unease become void? Tell me in what way they become void. My intention has been that we should know this. Then the Buddha answers, he has no perception of perception. He has no perception of non-perception. He is not without perception. He has no perception of void. For one who has attained thus, form becomes void. For founded in perception is diversifying designation. Then the questioner says, that which we asked you have related to us. Let us ask you something more. Please tell us this. Do indeed some intelligent ones here declare that the highest purity of the spirit is to that extent, or do they declare that it is even more than that? Then the Buddha answers, indeed, some intelligent ones here do declare that the highest purity of the spirit is to that extent, but then some of them, claiming to be adepts, declare an attainment in which nothing that was taken up remains. So having understood these to be dependent, the sage and investigator, having understood the ways of dependence, a released one, having understood, does not come to contention. The wise one does not attain to this or that existence. And that's the end of the sutta. And there's some parts of this sutta that were very difficult to translate. I mean, some suttas or portions of suttas in the Atthakavagga rely on plays on words like puns, but so then you have the difficulty of trying to find an English word that can have the same play on words as the Pali original, which sometimes is very difficult. I was racking my brains very, very long and hard when I was translating this. So I suppose one of the first things that I should mention is that this question and answer format, like most of the sutta, you may notice that it's very similar to the standard stock 12 Nidana theory of dependent co-origination. That I have another book here. This book, as far as I know, is out of print, my Atthakavagga translation, although it is free on the internet. This book, from which I'm going to be looking at the little chart that I made, is for sale on Amazon. And it does have a chapter on dependent co-arising. And so, I mean, I can include the graphic. It's going to require some editing, some extra hours of work. But essentially, let's see. Maybe you could just kind of, let's see, like do a screenshot of that, which will save me the work of making the graphic. But you'll see that on this chart here, I made 4 different versions of dependent co-arising or proto-dependent co-arising. First, you've got the stock 12 Nidana theory, which is, ignorance leads to karma conditions, which leads to consciousness, which leads to name and form, which leads to the 6 sense bases, which leads to stimulation or contact, which leads to feeling, which leads to craving, which leads to uptake or clinging, which leads to the force of existence, which then leads to birth, and that leads to aging, death, grief, lamentation, pain, unhappiness, and despair. The longest sutta, and considered to be like the cardinal sutta explaining dependent co-arising, is the Mahanidana Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, or Digha Nikaya number 15, which has a somewhat different list of causes and conditions, which I won't go into just for the sake of time. Then I've got 2 proto-dependent co-arisings. One is from the Sakapanya Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, which is Digha Nikaya number 21. And then one is this same Kalaha-vivaada Sutta that I have just read. And in Kalaha-vivaada Sutta, if you tease out, all the questions and answers and kind of put it in reverse order, because they start with the end, which is the list of unpleasant things. And then what causes that? And then the Buddha answers. And then what causes that? The Buddha answers, until he gets to sort of like the original source. of samsaric dukkha, unease. So if we just sort of pull out the this causes that, causes that, causes that from the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta, you wind up with perception causes differentiating designation. So sanya causes papancha sankha, which then causes name and form, which then causes stimulation or contact, which then causes pleasant and unpleasant, which then causes inclination or desire, chanda, which then causes what is loved, which is piya. And then what is loved results in quarrels, contentions, lamentations, grief, fear of loss, and conceit and contempt. Conceit and contempt are mana and atimana. So mana is like having a high opinion of yourself, usually. Atimana is having a low opinion of others because of the high opinion of yourself. So if you compare the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta version to like the stock 12 links version of dependent core rising, you see that there are definitely some parallels, some similarities. Although, according to the stock version, it starts with ignorance. Avijja is the cause, like the earliest cause that is mentioned. In the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta, it is perception. And it can go either way. In fact, you could say that perception is a kind of ignorance. Perception is a kind of delusion. In fact, I've often said perception is samsara. So then perception leads to like differentiation and just sort of identifying all these different things, including identifying with one of these things that one is diversifying. So that part really doesn't reflect very well in the stock 12 Nidana theory. But then the next one is name and form, Namarupa, which is in the stock 12 Nidana theory. Then the next link is Pasa, Paso, which is, I translated as stimulation, usually it's translated as contact. And that's also in the 12 Nidana thing, the 12 Nidana version. Except the six sense bases don't come in between. So in the original stock version of dependent core rising, you got name and form leads to the six sense bases, which leads to stimulation. Whereas in the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta, it's just name and form leads to stimulation. It doesn't mention the six sense bases. Then the next version is, the next step, I should say, is stimulation leads to pleasant and unpleasant. And in the stock form of dependent core rising, it is feeling, which, I mean, pleasant and unpleasant is really a kind of synonym, or very close to being a synonym for feeling. So again, you have like a close parallel between the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta and this stock 12 Nidana theory. So then, pleasant and unpleasant leads to inclination or desire, whereas in the stock version, feeling leads to craving. So again, obvious parallel. Then, inclination or desire leads to what is loved, and that would be more or less parallel to clinging in the stock version. And then it skips everything like force of existence and birth and just goes straight to the climactic list of all these unpleasant things that are caused by this chain of causation or causes or like conditions. So one interesting thing though is that nowhere that I have ever seen is the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta described as a kind of dependent core rising or proto-dependent core rising. Like in the commentaries, they don't seem to notice. The Burmese scholars don't seem to notice. But, I mean, if you really chart it out, you can see that the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta really does contain a kind of alternate 12 Nidana theory, although it's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Nidana theory in the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta. And it does seem to me that the 12 Nidana theory is it does not originate with Gautama Buddha himself. According to legend, the Buddha almost didn't start teaching Buddhism. He almost became like a Pacceka Buddha, just like a hermit that didn't teach Dhamma, an enlightened hermit, just because he figured nobody would understand dependent core rising. And there is a lot of truth to that legend, because I really don't think that Orthodox Theravada Buddhism really understands dependent core rising. The 12 Nidana theory, there's different versions of it in the text. Like I already mentioned, the most cardinal canonical text specifically dedicated to describing and explaining dependent core rising is the Mahanidana Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, and it differs from the stock 12 Nidana theory. See, it's only got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 links instead of 12. So I would agree with G.C. Pandey in his book Studies and Origins of Buddhism that dependent core rising wasn't originally this list of causes and conditions leading to this next thing, like a chain. I really don't think that is originally what the Buddha had in mind. But because he was correct that almost nobody was going to understand it, that even early Buddhist philosophers who were helping to formulate orthodoxy didn't understand it, and they just turned it into this chain of causes and conditions, with earlier texts like the central portion of the Sakapanya Sutta and also this like question-answer chain of questions and answers in the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta were like prototypes upon which they based this interpretation of dependent core rising. And the purpose of this video really isn't to explain dependent core rising. I think I've actually done that on other videos to some degree, although the Buddha almost didn't teach Buddhism according to legend because he thought nobody was going to understand it. And if he didn't succeed very well, then who am I to try to explain it? I do think, though, that Nagarjuna understood it better than any famous Buddhist philosopher. Unfortunately, though, he was not a Theravada Buddhist. So that was one of the main things I wanted to bring up with regard to the importance of the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta, even though it's rather obscure, is that it contains one of the early prototypes of the later, more refined, more polished 12 Nidana theory, with somewhat of different emphasis. You know, it's starting with just perception is like the root cause of all of our troubles. And like I've already said, perception is samsara. Perception is maya. It is illusion that we are wallowing in. And to the extent that we identify with perceptions and consider them to be real, when really they're just symbols, mind-generated symbols, then we're just living in this virtual reality. So anyways, I'll go back to the sutta here. Let's see. There were a few renderings in my translation that I would like to explain a little bit if I happen to notice them. Like preference. You know, I've translated the Pali word chanda as preference, when usually it's translated as desire. But I mean, that's neither here nor there. One reason why I translated it as preference is because it's also a technical term with regard to monastic discipline. If a monk is unable to attend a formal act of the Sangha, he can send his chanda, it's like his vote or his approval of the proceedings through a proxy. And so in that case, preference, I think, would fit the meaning better than desire, although it's kind of a judgment call on my part. Let's see. Brooding uncertainty is katang kata, which is a kind of, it's in a way it's a kind of defilement or obstacle in Dhamma practice, in spiritual practice. It's brooding uncertainty is just sort of like this indecision because you're unsure of you're just thinking too much, essentially. Katan kata just means like, how or what, just it's like, let's just call it brooding uncertainty. So then let's see. Discrimination is vinichya. There's a lot of bad mouthing of vinichya or discrimination in the Atthakavagga. I mean, that's one of the central themes, is that the sage does not discriminate. And like towards the top of the proto-dependent core rising in the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta is differentiation. Papancha is second on the list right after perception. Sometimes it's, let's see, papancha sanya sankha, where perception is just combined into differentiation. So let's see here. Oh, here it's kind of interesting. In verse 8, the Buddha says, in verse 8, the questioner asks, and non-existence and existence too, whatever that means, tell me that in which they are founded. And then the Buddha says, in stimulation are founded pleasant and unpleasant. In stimulation not being, they do not exist. Non-existence and existence too, whatever it means, I tell you that they are founded in this. So existence and non-existence, according to the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta, are founded in stimulation or contact. So that would seem to indicate that existence and non-existence, and at least in this context, are mental states. So let's see here. We're getting down to like what I consider to be one of the most interesting parts of the sutta is in answer to the question in verse 12, in one how attained does form become void, and how also do ease and unease become void? Tell me in what way they become void. My intention has been that we should know this. And then the Buddha says in Pali, na sanyasanyi na visanyasanyi, no pi asanyi, na vibhutasanyi, evam sametasa vibhoti rupam, sanya nidana hi papancha sankha. So, my English translation, and this is a difficult verse to translate. He has no perception of perception. He has no perception of non-perception. He is not without perception. He has no perception of void. For one who has attained thus, form becomes void, for founded in perception is diversifying designation. So this is like a Zen koan. This is sort of like proto-Zen, where he has no perception of perception, he has no perception of non-perception, he is not without perception, and he has no perception of void. So it's kind of like an enigma or a paradox where it would seem that the Buddha is ruling out all possibilities. That is what the enlightened mind is like. It's like you're not perceiving like things, you're not perceiving the absence of things. You're not without perception though. But it's like you're not even perceiving voidness. So, I mean, that is a koan. You can just grind away just trying to understand the meaning of this. And I do think that this enigmatic verse was so misunderstood that it wound up becoming a formless realm. And I've written on this before also, the origin of the four formless jhanas, or the four formless spheres, that I really don't consider the four formless jhanas or contemplations to be original teachings of the Buddha, just like I don't consider the 12 Nidana theory to be original teachings of the Buddha. That it was, they arose fairly early on in Buddhist history. Pretty much all the schools of Buddhism hold them in common, but still there was 100 years after the Buddha died and before the first schisms started taking place, the first schisms that really were permanent. And within 100 years, a lot of changes can happen. A lot of changes happen in early Christianity in their first 100 years too. So I think the commentarial tradition, maybe I should have looked this up before doing this video, but I think the commentarial tradition has this weird, obscure interpretation of this verse of he has no perception of perception, he has no perception of non-perception, etc., as a kind of being almost at some jhanic level, sort of like at the transition between jhanas. And going with the context, that's clearly not what the Buddha is talking about. The Buddha is describing an enlightened mind. The enlightened mind has no perception of perception, has no perception of non-perception, is not without perception, and has no perception of void. It's just like this kind of a perception that is denatured. The perception is still there in a sense, but the enlightened mind has transcended it, and it's just nature taking its course, where the enlightened mind is operating at a completely different level. The perceptions become practically irrelevant. And then the idea that it is describing the enlightened mind is just borne out in what follows. So the questioner then asks, that which we asked you have related to us. Let me ask you something more. Please tell us this. Do indeed some intelligent ones here declare that the highest purity of the spirit is to that extent, like what the Buddha just said with regard to no perception of perception, etc.? Or do they declare that it is even more than that? And it seems to be like the argument of which is parinibbana higher than nibbana? Like, you've got an enlightened sage who is still alive. So he still has like residual karma. He still has personality traits and so forth. So this questioner is asking is after the enlightened being dies. And so let's see, where nothing that was taken up remains. That's after, the body is gone, the karma is gone. It's just poof. The questioner is asking, some people say that like this enlightenment after death is higher than enlightenment before death, and so he's asking the Buddha, is parinibbana a higher state than just nibbana while a sage is still alive? And then the Buddha says, indeed, some intelligent ones here do declare that the highest purity of the spirit is to that extent, but then some of them, claiming to be adepts, declare an attainment in which nothing that was taken up remains. So nibbana versus parinibbana. And then he says, so having understood these to be dependent, the sage and investigator, having understood the ways of dependence, a released one, having understood, does not come to contention. The wise one does not attain to this or that existence. So the Buddha is just kind of just dismissing the whole question. It's just still, if you're wrangling about which is better, which is higher, you're still not there. You still don't get it. But I should get back to the four formless jhanas. That I do think that enigmatic Zen koan like verse of he has no perception of perception, he has no perception of non-perception, etc., it could be like the origin of the realm of neither perception nor non-perception. That the four formless jhanas, like I was saying, I don't think that they originated with the Buddha. And there is some evidence for this. Like in the text, it talks about four jhanas, like Satipatthana Sutta or the Mahasatipatthana Sutta defines right concentration or Sammasamadhi as the four jhanas. Also, the Samanyapala Sutta, which is an archaic text, and I probably, if I continue with these videos on archaic Buddhism, I should probably do one on the Samanyapala Sutta, which is a relatively very early text, and it could have like a historical like precedent or origin in which King Ajatasattu comes and talks to the Buddha. So in this Samanyapala Sutta, it's giving like increasingly deep or increasingly important benefits of living the monk's life. And it mentions the four jhanas, and then after the four jhanas, it just goes right into psychic powers. There's no mention at all of the formless realms. In fact, there's no mention at all of the four stages of Aryahood or sainthood in the Samanyapala Sutta, which is kind of a glaring omission. And I also consider the 4 stages of Aryahood also to be a later development. I mean, not much later. It may be, a good chance it happened within the first 100 years of the existence of the Buddha Sasana after the Buddha's passing away. But, for example, Samanyapala Sutta just doesn't mention it at all, even though it's considered, presumably very important. But getting back to the 4 formless jhanas, it sometimes the commentarial tradition will try to kind of make things fit, when it's talking about the 4 jhanas and not mentioning 8 jhanas, just 4, that the commentarial tradition will say, well, the 4 arupa jhanas or the 4 formless spheres are just a kind of annex to 4th jhana. They're just sort of different kinds of 4th jhana. But really, the suttas don't really bear that out. And there is another little bit of evidence that the 4 formless jhanas are a later addition in the Buddha's own death, like the episode of the Buddha's parinibbana in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, where it was apparently considered in ancient India that 4th jhana is like the jumping off point to enlightenment. So, it wasn't universally accepted that way. And a lot of the Vipassana people nowadays, including like the Mahasi people in Burma, don't accept that. They can say you can become fully enlightened without any jhanas at all. But there was at least a large proportion of early Buddhists who did consider 4th jhana to be like the jumping off point to enlightenment. So when the Buddha dies, or as he is dying, he goes into 1st jhana, then he goes into 2nd jhana, then he goes into 3rd jhana, then he goes into 4th jhana, then he goes into the formless sphere of infinite space, the formless sphere of infinite consciousness, the formless sphere of nothingness, the formless sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. Then I think he goes into Nirodha Samapati, which is the cessation of perception and feeling. But he doesn't go into parinibbana from there. He then goes all the way back down to 1st jhana and then goes up to 4th jhana, and then he dies while he's in 4th jhana. So, that could be kind of monkeying with the story to fit in all the later stages, including Nirodha Samapati, but still staying with the older idea of the Buddha kind of jumping off into parinibbana from 4th jhana. So I guess, let's see. So I'll look through it just one last time before I finish this, just in case I have overlooked anything. So let's see. Yeah, I think I pretty much covered what I wanted to say. There are certain important qualities of the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta that I really wanted to mention. First of all, of course, it's included in the Atthakavagga, which is very archaic Buddhism. Like I already mentioned, it's probably the largest fragment of really archaic Buddhism still in existence. So going with that, potentially at least, rightfully, it should be the most important Buddhist document in existence, since it comes closest chronologically to what the Buddha originally taught. Or at least it could be argued that way. Some people would say, well, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta is earlier because that's the Buddha's first sermon. But as like the scholar K.R. Norman points out, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta contains anachronisms. It's like assumes a knowledge of Buddhist doctrine, even though the Buddha is supposedly like just now starting to teach it. So tradition is one thing. There should be a certain respect for it, a certain knowledge of it, definitely, if you want to be literate in the tradition. But still, just because something is tradition does not necessarily mean that it is gospel truth. So one of the first thing to bear in mind with the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta is that it is very archaic. It's part of the Atthakavagga, which is mentioned in other texts. For example, there's a story found in Vinaya and also in the suttas of a monk named Sona Kurikana who goes to pay respects to the Buddha. The Buddha says, speak some Dhamma. And so Sona Kurikana recites the Atthakavagga to him. And it even mentions in the text that it has 16 parts, which is still the case today in the Atthakavagga. Also, one of the most important things to bear in mind with the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta, at least from my point of view, is it does contain one of the earliest prototypes of the finished version of dependent co-arising. And also, there is that enigmatic Zen koan-like verse about he has no perception of perception, etc., which I think could be the prototype or the origin of the realm of neither perception nor non-perception. Just as there's like an archaic fragment found in the Majjhima Nikaya and the Digha Nikaya, which implies that Nibbana or Nirvana is infinite formless consciousness, and those fragments could have been the original version of the formless realm of infinite consciousness. That as orthodoxy was developing and they were sort of hammering out what was and was not going to be official Buddhist dogma, that those archaic verses, those fragments saying that nirvana is essentially infinite formless consciousness, they just kind of fell out of fashion. They couldn't be just completely edited out of the song or out of the suttas, just like the Atthakavagga couldn't, even though they contained heterodox material by later standards. So they just say, well, that's, let's just call that like a very advanced contemplative realm that isn't enlightenment yet, but still it's nothing to sneeze your nose at. And then finally, the third, like, philosophically important point that I was going to bring up with regard to the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta is this argument that was actually mentioned in my Discord server, which is sort of what inspired me to finally make this video, about how Theravadan tradition, sometimes at least some people will consider parinibbana to be a higher state than just nibbana. In other words, when a fully enlightened being is still alive, there's still like residual, like almost defilements or something that is limiting his enlightenment somehow, so that after the enlightened being dies, the body stops, the karmic stream stops, then it's somehow superior. But the Buddha just says, people who argue like this are still unenlightened. And you just leave it at that, I suppose. And I guess that's my little discourse on the Kalaha-vivaada Sutta. And there's a good chance I'll be continuing with this series that was discontinued for quite some time. I just happen to have a day off from work. It's Labor Day at the time that I'm recording this. So I guess in conclusion, I'll just say be happy.